It is no secret that the People's Republic of China wants unification with Taiwan. Unification, or to the PRC, reunification, has been official policy since Mao Zedong's victory in 1949 over the Kuomintang, when Chiang Kai-shek's government fled to the island, establishing the Republic of China on Taiwan. Outside of initial plans by Mao at forceful unification, PRC policy has long been such a process would ideally be done peacefully. However, in 2005, the 10th National People's Congress in China passed an anti-secession law authorizing military force for unification. Over the last 2 decades, there has been a 15-fold increase in Chinese military spending, with a significant portion dedicated to the capabilities necessary to seize the island through force. Xi Jinping has even publicly stated he wants the capability of a military invasion by 2027. This has elevated the prospect of China's military conquest of Taiwan to one of the most significant geopolitical concerns within the Western Pacific and the world. At present, the major roadblock to the PRC's military ambitions is the United States, but we do have to factor in the current US administration that seems to love upending historical foreign policy. Hostility towards China, the initiation of a trade war, and public statements from Trump officials have signaled a desire to contain Chinese ambitions, which one would presume would include their territorial desires. Certainly, people like Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth have talked about US military weakness in the face of Chinese military strength and the necessity to rectify such a situation. But from what Hegseth has said, he's looking to American military strength as a deterrent in regards to China, and Trump himself is only looking for a trade war here, not the shooting kind. It's ironic, then, that Trump's actions may ultimately have the opposite effect, because his policies regarding economic relations with China and US relations with their allies undermine 2 of the 3 major deterrents putting a check on China implementing the forceful unification of Taiwan. And the third one, the US military itself, has had the perception of its strength actively undermined by Hegseth. But wait, I can hear you asking, what does Trump's economic policy with China and foreign policy with, well, everyone, have to do with making it more likely Xi Jinping decides to invade Taiwan? Jinping's decision would have everything to do with the potential geopolitical and economic costs to China, and Trump's policies are actively reducing those costs. Before I get to that, however, I want to go over the history of how China, Taiwan, and the USA got to this point. As stated at the beginning of the video, the People's Republic of China, led by Mao, defeated the Republic of China, led by Chiang, on the mainland in 1949. The bulk of remaining ROC government and veteran military personnel fled to the island of Taiwan. Over the next 2 years, the PRC's focus was on conquering what they deemed the rest of mainland China. This not only included southern regions that were still under the control of the ROC, but also Tibet and Xinjiang, the former of which had declared independence back in 1911. Historical side note, the PRC also had claims on Mongolia, but made no attempt to invade due to it being a client state of the USSR. It was only in 2012 that China officially acknowledged Mongolia is not a part of its constitutionally claimed territory. So it was in the early 1950s that the PRC started making concrete plans to take Taiwan. It was during this time that the United States, led by Harry Truman, deployed the US 7th Fleet in the Taiwan Strait, directly between the island and the mainland. So began the USA's policy of de facto defense of Taiwan. Now, until 1971, the United States was also recognizing the Republic of China on Taiwan as the official government of all of China. It was only after Richard Nixon normalized relations with the PRC that the USA dropped that recognition, moving towards the One China policy. In 1979, under Jimmy Carter, the current status quo was established. For all intents and purposes, the US treats Taiwan as an independent country, but never officially, and also established formal diplomatic ties with China. In addition, while Joe Biden had on multiple occasions stated that the United States would defend Taiwan if China invaded unilaterally, the historic US foreign policy position on defending Taiwan was more vague, a policy called strategic ambiguity. The whole reason for this complicated song and dance is so that the United States and China could work together geopolitically. China can pretend the USA endorses her position regarding unification with Taiwan, and the USA can pretend China will give up on unifying with Taiwan. First, because it put China and the USA on the same anti-USSR team, and for the last several decades, well, because trade is good. It would be a mistake to characterize any of these foreign policy relationships as being friends, whether that's the United States with Taiwan or the United States with China. That's just not how foreign policy works. To borrow a phrase from Beau of the Fifth Column, now Belle of the Ranch, nations don't have friends, they have interests. It has long been in U.S. national interest to maintain Taiwanese independence. For the last 50-plus years, it has also been in U.S. national interest to have some level of friendly relations with China. As I have talked about in earlier videos, this also has nothing to do with morality. Reminder, foreign policy in the current world isn't about morality, it's about power. In the 1950s and 60s, despite the cruelty of Chiang's authoritarian government, the United States benefited from having friendly relations with Taiwan. So the United States not only protected the island from potential PRC conquest, but also provided substantial economic aid. As for the beginning of official foreign policy relations with China under the PRC, the USA was strongly motivated by the mutual hostility the United States and China had towards the USSR. From that foundation, mutually beneficial trade developed, in part as an outgrowth of internal Chinese economic reforms. I will note again, despite the very real humanitarian benefits in the long run for, say, Taiwanese citizens attaining a liberal democracy, or the many Chinese citizens whose standard of living has risen remarkably in the last 3 decades, those were not the specific intentions of the friendly relationship between the US and Taiwan, or the US and China. From the United States' perspective, it was about the economic and geopolitical benefits the US could attain. Likewise, China's friendlier relations with the United States were not about the benefits to Americans having more goods more cheaply, but about China's own economic growth, and originally geopolitical security against the USSR. For Taiwan, by adopting policies over the decades that have established themselves as a critical supplier of electronic components, especially semiconductors, they have ensured the United States views Taiwanese national security as an extension of their own. This isn't for the benefit of the US, but for Taiwan. This is a large part of why Joe Biden pushed for the CHIPS and Science Act, providing government funding to jumpstart semiconductor manufacturing within the United States, so the US wouldn't be as reliant on Taiwan for these components. And the Taiwanese government is kind of nervous about that, simply because of the prospect the United States could shift to a point where they aren't reliant on Taiwan semiconductors, and the question of whether the US would still defend them against China. Another side note, the Republican Congress, and now Trump himself, have actively undercut the CHIPS and Science Act by either delaying or attempting to strip funding. Regardless, for the foreseeable future, the United States will remain heavily reliant on Taiwan's semiconductors and other electronic production. So for at least that duration, the United States is incentivized to maintain a foreign policy position of protecting Taiwanese independence. This brings me back to my opening thesis, of how Trump's policies are actively undermining the economic and geopolitical deterrents that help keep China in check. The deterrent that Trump's policies have had the most limited impact on is the US military. The Navy, Air Force, and military bases the United States has positioned across the Western Pacific are a potent threat to any Chinese attempt to invade the island. Until the 21st century, the relative military power between the US and China made any attempt impossible. However, the numbers have changed in the last 2 decades as China's official military spending has crossed $200 billion a year, unofficial estimates placing it around $300 billion, including a navy that in total number of ships is the largest in the world. In short, the relative power shift of the United States military versus the Chinese military has been a decades-long process, and the second Trump administration's current policies wouldn't be enough on their own to have affected the reality of that dynamic. But what could shift is the perception of the US military. And on this front, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has done a masterful job of emphasizing US military weakness. In my video on Trump's first 50 days of foreign policy, I mentioned how in Hegseth's first European trip, he made an off-the-cuff remark about how the United States Navy was not capable of providing security in the Pacific while also challenging the Russian Navy. I not only believe this to be a false statement, I mean, Ukraine has been able to challenge the Russian Navy when Ukraine doesn't even have a navy. But even if it was true, that's not the kind of thing you want the Secretary of Defense saying out loud. It is, in essence, the leader of the US military publicly telling its allies and adversaries, we are too weak to uphold our security guarantees. In effect, the message US allies are hearing is, oh, the US can't protect us, and what US adversaries are hearing is, oh, the US is currently vulnerable. It gets worse with a video that went viral last week. Now, to be fair to Hegseth, this interview was posted in November before he was Secretary of Defense, though also after he was nominated. I haven't been able to track down when it was recorded, but if it was after he was aware he was nominated or going to be nominated, his words are still a very serious issue. While being interviewed regarding his newest book, The War on Warriors, Pete Hegseth characterized the United States military as being pathetically weak when compared to China. Among the things he said in the interview, China's hypersonic missiles could destroy the entire US carrier fleet in 20 minutes, and that in every Pentagon war game between China and the United States, the US loses. Both of these statements are completely false. Number one, hypersonic missiles are certainly capable of sinking an aircraft carrier, but said carrier would have to be within their range to do so. Most sources I could find indicate China's anti-carrier hypersonic missiles have a range of about 1,500 kilometers. In any war with China, the odds are zero that the United States would have all of their carriers within that range. In addition, even though defenses against such missiles are limited, they do exist, so it is still possible for a targeted carrier to avoid sinking. In short, saying China could destroy the entire US carrier fleet in the first 20 minutes? No, not happening. Second, and more egregiously, since it is referring to something that has happened rather than something that could, in Pentagon war games, the US doesn't lose every time. In fact, in war games from 2023 and 2024, the outcomes for the United States and Taiwan improved over the war games between 2018 and 2022. Make no mistake, the losses are heavy for the USA and Taiwan regardless, but the most recent war games have them as the victors more often than not, and of the non-victories, almost always ending in a stalemate rather than an outright defeat. The point I'm making is that Pete Hegseth emphasizes American weakness against her geopolitical rivals to the point of exaggerating Chinese strength. This may play well as a Fox News commentator, but in foreign policy, it invites challenge from the USA's rivals, especially if you constantly tout how strong one rival in particular is against the United States. Now, obviously, Chinese military strength has increased over the last 2 decades, and after sitting on her laurels since the 1990s, the United States is showing gaps in her capabilities. After all, she does lose war games against China some of the time, when that was rarely the case pre-2018. But there are ways of making these assessments that aren't just saying the United States is weak. For example, when it comes to the 2024 assessment made by the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, they highlight the specific areas where the United States needs improvement to be better prepared for a potential conflict against China in defense of Taiwan. They note that in war games, the US quickly exhausts many important munitions, especially anti-ship missiles, within weeks or even days. Munitions that, given current military-industrial capacity, would take years to replenish. The Commission therefore offers solutions to that specific problem, not about making the US military tougher, but expanding munition manufacturing specifically, while eliminating other military programs that are outdated or don't get enough bang for the buck. It is also worth noting the Commission's findings emphasize the necessity of coordinating and collaborating with US allies and partners around the world. Which brings me to Trump alienating US allies and partners around the world. As I have talked about in previous videos, Trump and his administration quickly diverged from historical US policy when it came to the treatment of US allies and partners. The immediate threats to Panama, Denmark, regarding Greenland, and Canada were an unanticipated hostile opening to Trump's foreign policy. This was followed up by Hegseth's aforementioned trip to Europe, in which he plainly said the United States was not going to be a guarantor of European security in the future, undermining US foreign policy since World War II. Combined with the first leaked signal chat in which top Trump officials spoke disparagingly of European allies, and also publicly speaking disparagingly of European allies, the current administration in the United States has shown how little it values mutual cooperation. Combined with Trump's tariffs on virtually every country on Earth, it has managed to alienate almost everyone, including the penguins. In the run-up to his Liberation Day tariff announcement, South Korea, Japan, and China announced they would jointly respond to US tariffs. Do you have any idea how badly you have to screw up to get South Korea, Japan, and China on the same team? I could go over that history, but that's another video in itself. Actually, if you would like to hear about that, subscribe, ring the bell, and comment below. What all of this alienation of American allies has to do with increasing the potential risk of China invading Taiwan is that the US would be the country leading the charge on economically isolating China, just like it was when it came to economically isolating Russia when it invaded Ukraine. And yes, the Russian economy has not yet collapsed, but they have had to pull every economic trick in the book to keep from doing so. Chinese concern over facing a similar united opposition, even if they achieve a fait accompli in seizing Taiwan, would cause hesitation in actually launching such an invasion. That was one of the important reasons for countries to remain united in their boycott of Russian goods, to show other countries, i.e. China, that there are severe economic consequences for occupying and or annexing another country. And yes, I know this is not universally applied. Morocco, Israel, Turkey, the USA, among many others. Reminder, foreign policy isn't about morality or consistency, it's about power. Though I will note, with that list of countries I mentioned, every instance without international consequences does increase the likelihood for other countries thinking they too can get away with their own invasions and occupations of their neighbors. Isn't that right, Azerbaijan? So yes, China is also looking at the consequences other countries have faced for invading their neighbors and weighs whether they would face the repercussions of Turkey or of Russia. Given I think we would all prefer not to return to the 1930s when it comes to the permissiveness of military conquest, we should hope the military and economic consequences of doing so would be high. But I repeat, with Trump alienating US allies, it significantly reduces the threat to China of united international opposition. And Trump's tariffs to China specifically also undercut the third major deterrent, the economic ties between the United States and China. In 2024, the total exchange of goods between the two countries was nearly $600 billion, 143.5 billion US exports to China, and 438.9 billion US imports from China. This accounts for roughly 10% of all Chinese global trade. In addition, as of December 2024, China holds $759 billion of US Treasury securities. These Treasury holdings are often used as an example of how the United States economy is vulnerable to Chinese manipulation, but that's only partially true. The true part is that China really does hold enough Treasury securities that, were they to sell them all at once, it would have a seriously detrimental effect on the US bond market, and by extension, the US economy. We only need to look at how the bond market reacted to Trump's tariffs to see how serious a problem that could be. However, dumping all those treasuries would arguably have a more detrimental effect on China's economy than the United States. This brings me to my point in how Trump's trade war is inadvertently affecting the deterrent that is China's economic ties to the US. In a war, trade between the two countries would automatically stop, and any US treasuries held by China would be frozen or even seized. The current tariffs the two countries have placed on each other are a huge disincentive for trade between the two going forward, and both countries will shift to other suppliers for goods. At the same time, these tariffs, along with those on other countries around the world, have hurt the perception of US Treasury securities as a safe and secure investment. It wouldn't be shocking if countries like China started to divest from those holdings. The combination of these two economic effects, divestment of Treasury holdings and less trade between the two largest economies in the world, would mean that any war between China and the US would have less of an immediate detrimental effect on the Chinese economy. Make no mistake, war would still be devastating on both countries' economies, but not to anything near the extent as they would today, being so mutually intertwined. Geopolitically, this is one of the major advantages of global trade. Generally speaking, it makes war between major trade partners less likely. Xi Jinping's desire for Taiwan, however, seems to be a major priority, in many ways not dissimilar to Vladimir Putin's desire for Ukraine. It was a huge geopolitical and economic error for Putin and Russia to invade Ukraine. To dissuade Xi from even trying to take Taiwan requires keeping the military, economic, and geopolitical costs high. Trump and his administration's policies are actively reducing those costs. It is for this reason that I fear with Xi's 2027 deadline for having China's military ready to invade Taiwan, he will try. I hope I am wrong. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. If you want to hear me talk about history and politics in the future, hit the subscribe and bell while you're at it. In the meantime, I already have several videos posted for you to enjoy or critique, and I invite your input in the comments below. Until next time, take care.